notice this with people all the time is when I'm talking to them and counseling them about how they might adjust their behavior and do one thing rather than another. People generally assume, here's the thing that I could do that's risky. And the baseline they compare that to is no risk. But that's wrong. Always. It's risk A or risk B. It's the risk of doing something versus the risk of not doing something. Or it's the risk of doing this instead of this. It's like risk is everywhere. So, do people make foolish risks? Well, sometimes, obviously. It's foolish to go play a slot machine. Because the bloody thing is stacked against you. So on average, you're going to lose. But you can't tell that to the person who just won the jackpot. Well, they gamble partly because it's fun. You know, like, and I mean that technically. Most of the neurochemicals that your brain produces that are associated with the kind of pleasure that people really like, which is like, for example, the kind of pleasure that drugs like cocaine produce, are produced by risky behavior that has the potential for high return. We like that sort of thing. And people are wired so that they're more responsive to the probability of something good happening than even to the good thing. So, for example, we know that if people win the lottery, a year later they're about the same as they were. No better, no worse. So, actually winning all that money has a limited long-term impact on their happiness. That's probably more determined by their trait temperament. But the lead up to the good event, that's the exciting part. It might happen, it might happen. That's excitement. And that's produced by, like gambling will produce that, especially for some people, because some people are really susceptible to that kind of reward. Everyone's susceptible to it to some degree, and that can be manipulated, and that's what slot machines do. Like slot machines manipulate the human propensity to engage in a certain kind of gambling behavior. And why do people gamble? Sometimes taking a risk really pays off. And not taking a risk is also a risk. So there's no way out of risk. It's gamble one way or another. We live on anticipation of reward. You know this. You're working like mad to get your bachelor's degree. You know, and you're really excited about the day that it occurs. Okay, what happens the week after? What happens the week after is that you're no longer in the pursuing a bachelor degree universe. You're now in the post-bachelor degree looking for a job universe. And that might not be nearly as pleasant a place. So the problem is when you attain a goal, the framework within which you were operating disappears. And there's no necessity that it's replaced by a better frame. In fact, lots of times it's replaced by chaos, at least for some period of time. So it's a really weird thing, and this is like the Sisyphus story. It's like, well, Sisyphus might be happy when he's rolling the rock up the hill. It's like a lottery ticket winner. You know, what are they paying for? They're paying for the fun that's associated with the anticipation of the reward. And the brain, you know, your emotional brain isn't that great at calculating mathematical probabilities. And so it sort of says, some chance. You have some chance of winning $50 million. Well, it might be 1 in 380 million, but your anticipation system isn't a mathematical system. It just says, well, you have some chance. That's a lot more than none. Well, in some ways, it's infinitely more than none. Because at zero, you have no chance. And, you know, with one ticket, you have some chance. So that gets the old excitement going. Men are more aggressive. Men have more testosterone than women. And men are more aggressive than women. And along with that aggression comes a greater propensity to take risks. And so you see this, the best example of that, really the best example is, and the best proof of it is the fact that there are way more male criminals than female criminals. Like, way more. And usually if you get a female criminal, you know, she's tangled up with some guy that dragged her along. I mean, not always, obviously, but it's like 10 to 1. So, yeah, men take more risks. There are more great successes among men and more catastrophic failures. And that's the case in most of the like sexually active animal kingdom. Men are relatively more expendable. So here's an example. More than twice as many of your ancestors are female than male. Because on average, almost every woman has one child. Whereas many, many men have none, and some have a lot, like really a lot. I think they estimate that Genghis Khan's genes are present in something like 30% of the Asian population. So there's massive mating success differential among men. And that also inclines them to take risks, because you can be fantastically successful genetically as a male, although you can fail absolutely, whereas with a woman can be moderately successful. The problem is, and this actually speaks to what people are like, benefit is finite and risk is infinite. You can die. You can only be so happy. Like, you can be really happy. Yeah. You can be, like, just 100% dead. And you're actually kind of wired that way, because people are more sensitive to negative events than to positive events. So a loss will hurt you more than a gain of the same magnitude will please you. So the reason I'm saying that is because it shows you that we're actually set up for a risky world. Our nervous systems are tuned to be more sensitive to negative information because the world's so damn risky. Now, we'd be completely hiding like a nocturnal animal, except that, we figured out ways to make risk valuable. So we're ambivalent creatures. We're thrilled by opportunity and terrified by it at the same time, which is exactly how it should be. Risk is everywhere. That's the first truth of Buddhism, right? Suffering is inevitable. Life is suffering. Same thing. Risk is everywhere. Life is suffering. Period. So, partly when you're saying, well, can you regulate the collapse of these macro systems? You're saying, well, can you eliminate risk? Well, no, you can't. I don't think. In fact, you could argue, I shouldn't say that exactly. I think there is one way that you can minimize risk. Don't be crooked. The less crooked your society is, the more you mitigate risk. But you can't eliminate it. If you're accustomed to keeping things in the fog in general, you're going to keep yourself in the fog with regards to your investments. Because in some sense, everything you do is an investment. Right? I mean, some of it's quantified in monetary terms, but you're always investing in one manner or another. And so I think if your character has been disrupted by your persistent attempts to deceive yourself about the nature of reality, you're going to be a financial train wreck. And I mean, I've certainly seen that in my clinical practice. I've seen people burn through amounts of money that you wouldn't think someone could burn through in that short a period of time because of self-deceptive blindness. Yeah, well, the problem is that what defines risk is often defined by herd behavior. The least risky thing is what everyone is doing. Like, if you're in a herd, that's certainly the case. The least risky thing is to be in the middle of what everyone else in the herd is doing. Predators can't pick you off then. And people act like that all the time. And so, a stock market investment might look risky when hardly anyone is doing it, because the way that your brain is judging risk is by the number of people doing it. But as soon as everyone's doing it, the risky thing is to be left behind. Because if you're left behind, predators will get you. You're the straggling sheep. And so what that means is the definition of what constitutes conservative changes as mass behavior changes. So it isn't even obvious how to advise people as to what the conservative path is. Now, a standard economic advisor would say, diversify. Well, yeah, I'll tell you, in the 2008 crash, you could have diversified your money across multiple markets all over the world. It wouldn't help you a damn bit. Everything came down. So, yeah, you can diversify, but that increases your transaction costs, and you have to have quite a bit of money to do it, and you have to have quite a bit of knowledge. And so, the thing is, it's not that easy to make a pile of grain last. And that's what we're always trying to do. It disappears of its own accord. It deteriorates. Money does that with inflation. People are always trying to nibble away at it, and then now and then there's an earthquake and all the grain disappears into the ground. It's hard to preserve value across time. And you could say that about your body. There, it's valuable. Well, in the natural state, wolves would be after it. It's hard to preserve value across time. And how you do that, there's no surefire way of doing it. Conservative way of doing it, that can fail. A risky way of doing it, that can succeed. It also depends on what you mean by success. Right? Because to judge whether someone's a winner or loser means you have to set a priori standards by which to judge them. And that is not simple. In our culture, people love celebrities. I'd love to be a celebrity. Well, sure, that's what you think, but Marilyn Monroe wasn't served well by it. Doesn't really look like Elvis was. There's a long list of collapsing celebrities. So were they successful? Not by the standards of reasonable longevity. They were successful by Neil Young's standards, right? Better to burn out than to fade away. Okay, maybe. Maybe it's better to burn bright longer. But it's arguable,
Right.
You can say a life without risk is hardly worth having. It might be secure, although it isn't, because as I said, not taking a risk also constitutes a risk. And when you look back, people often are more upset about the things they didn't do, the chances they didn't take, than the failures that they encountered. Now, not always, obviously, it depends on the failure. But, you can sit at home encased in styrofoam and have your meals delivered. And you're probably, you're not going to get mugged, probably. But what's a hell of a life? Psychologists have struggled for a long time to define mental health and pathology. It's really hard because mental illness and even physical illness, it's not simple. It's not, sometimes it is. There's a pathogen or not. Even then it's complicated because you can't tell why the pathogen popped up at that point. But anyways, in mental health, it's even more difficult. So, people have tried to define what constitutes optimal health or optimal performance in a system or a person in a bunch of different ways. You can say, well, deviation from the average is pathological, but we don't think about that with talent or beauty or intelligence. So as a general principle, that can't be right. Some people have said for mental health that a system is unhealthy when it deviates from its evolutionary function. Well, I don't buy that because it's very difficult to specify the evolutionary function of all sorts of things. So that just doesn't solve the problem for me. What seems to happen, as far as I can tell, is that things are useful up to a certain point, and once they dominate, and sort of like the Cyclops image, with the Cyclops only seeing one thing. If you get too single-minded about anything, any virtue, or any behavior for that matter, it hits a point where it starts to turn back on itself, and then you've gone too far. And when it turns back on itself, it hits what's technically called a positive feedback loop, and then the thing spirals out of control catastrophically and unpredictably. And I can give you some examples of that. So let's say you start to get depressed. Okay, and maybe you're slowly getting more and more depressed. Well, there's going to be a tipping point, or there often is a tipping point, where you're so depressed, you quit going to work and you lose your job. Well, that's not so good for your depression, because now you're not only depressed, you're unemployed, and you don't have any money. Well, and then maybe, your wife is getting pretty tired of having to deal with you because you're depressed, and now you also don't have a job, and the stress is too much for her, and so you fight a lot, and that makes you more depressed. And then you start to stay at home because you don't really want to show your face in public, so you lose all your friends, and man, it's a cliff. So you're doing not too bad, even though it might be a downhill walk, until you hit this, single event, and then it just goes whomp. Because being unemployed makes you more depressed, and that makes it less likely that you're going to look for a job. And with alcoholism, and other forms of addiction, what seems to happen to me is that you hit the positive feedback loop point when you start using the drug to cure its own withdrawal symptoms. So you're not in trouble with cocaine until you start using it because the cocaine has made you feel bad. The withdrawal. Same with alcohol. You're all shaky and you got the shakes and so on, and you figure out one day, Jesus, a shot of vodka, I'm good. Yeah. No. You're firmly in the grip of the devil at that point. And I think a lot of systems are like this. They work fine, but as they get more and more exaggerated, they get closer and closer to a tip-off point, and then the tip-off point is where all hell breaks loose. And virtues are even like that. So we know, for example, that conscientiousness is a trait, and conscientious people are industrious and orderly. So it's like the Protestant work ethic. Okay. We also know that orderliness is grounded in disgust sensitivity. Okay. We know that orderly people, on average, have better hygienic habits, and they live longer. But they're also more inclined to radically disapprove of homosexual behavior. They're also more anti-foreigner, because they have a real tight me, not me discrimination system, and they're disgusted by what's not me. Well, that's good. You don't like dirt. And you can be sure that among our forefathers, it was very frequent, if you were an explorer and you went out to meet a bunch of strangers, you and your whole damn crew were dead 3 weeks later. Because they gave you some disease you have no resistance to whatsoever, and it just wiped you out. I mean, that's what happened to the Native Americans. And it wiped out 95% of them. You know, this is a deadly thing. Anyways, as orderliness increases in its intensity, it starts to shade into like vicious intolerance. So the fascists, for example, the Nazis, were orderly. They didn't like parasites. And they thought of anything that wasn't just like them, their corporate body, the Aryans, was a parasite and it should be eradicated. That's a pretty good idea when you're eradicating parasites. I mean, Hitler tried to get rid of tuberculosis to begin with. But then the question arises, what's a parasite? At some point, it's like everyone who isn't me. And, you know, Hitler got to that point before he died because he felt that the whole German society, he lost faith in the Aryan society as the war was being lost. And he was perfectly happy that the bloody place went up in fire, which is a purifying element. So, you know, even, look, conscientiousness is virtuous. But you take any virtue too far, off the cliff you fall. So there's like this range within which something works. And when you push it past that range, it starts to feed on itself and it turns into some variant of hell. I mean, we know from a statistical perspective that if you're intelligent, so if you have a high IQ, which to some degree is a matter of chance, by the way, unless you think you had some choice in picking your parents or their entire evolutionary history. So if you have a high IQ and you're conscientious, which is another trait, then you're more likely to be financially successful, say, by the time you're in middle age. And so that looks like two temperamental traits whose presence enables you to beat randomness over time. But you could object to that and say, well, that happens to be true for this society at this point in time. And that's probably true because I think, imagine conscientious people store more value. They hoard more things. Well, in a different society, that would just make you a target for murder. So those traits work very well in this society at this time, but you can also argue that that's also a matter of chance because there wouldn't be unconscientious people if at some point in the past unconscientiousness hadn't aided their survival. So what constitutes beating a system depends on the parameters that you put around the system. And you know, you can think the same thing about, well, look at how successful he is. Okay, you mean financially. All right, so then, well, how's his health? How's his marriage? How are his relationships with his children? What price did he pay for his wealth? You know, like as you add dimensions of evaluation, whether that particular person won or lost might not be so self-evident. Well, I think the probability of a collapse is proportional to the number of events occurring. And so the more events occur, the more likely, extremely unlikely events are to take place. And everything's been speeding up, really speeding up. I mean, you think about how many trades now are made in microseconds by computer. You know, so my suspicions are if you calculated the complexity of the trading system and held that constant, that the rate of failure would be about the same. It seems to me highly probable. In fact, it would really surprise me if that wasn't the case, because that's basically how systems work. You know, there's a certain number of events that are outliers per certain number of events. So if you raise the number of events, you raise the number of outliers. And so and you see this, I think, also reflected in things like tech company growth and collapse. You know, 20 years ago, the average lifespan of a company was, you know, perhaps something around 30 to 40 years. My suspicions are now that on average, especially in fast-changing fields, that they don't last that long. So, you know, we're speeding, you know, if you think time is actually a measure of events, average number of events, well, events are occurring a lot faster now. So time in some sense is sped up, at least in certain systems. So I think what people have to adapt to the fact that systems chronically collapse at every level of severity. And that's life. Life is the sequential collapse of systems at each level of resolution. And so systems last for a while, great, depend on them. But then they collapse. And you need to be the sort of thing that can transform itself during a collapse so that you're there for the next system. And that's a death and rebirth, essentially. That's your death and rebirth, so that the old you that was in the old environment gets punished out of existence, and that hurts like hell and gets you all depressed and anxious. And then you're in a state of crisis, and as things fall apart, and then up comes a new you, and there's a new environment, and away you go. And so people have to be disciplined enough to be part of a system, and flexible enough to transform when the system fails. And that's basically the two fundamental adaptive elements that enable successive living. And people have known that in one form or another in story form for thousands of years.
Oh, nice.
Enthusiasm is contagious, especially among the enthusiastic. And you might say, well, you should be enthusiastic. Well, you should be enthusiastic when the probability of reward is high. Problem is you can't tell. Now, if everybody's running around going, the probability of reward is high, and you're enthusiastic, you're going to get caught up in that. And then everybody's going to get caught up in it, and then the probability of reward is going to be high for a while, till you run out of enthusiastic people. And then bang, game over. So, why are people like that? Well, we're great mimics. And the fact that we get enthusiastic and imitate each other makes us able to cooperate, because like if, say you're a leader, you want to fill me with enthusiasm so I can go off and do impossible things. And that happens sometimes, you can come up with some harebrained, absurdly optimistic scheme like we'll go to the moon in 5 years, and which is impossible, of course, and then everybody thinks, oh, that would be great, and there's a huge movement, and poof, you're on the moon in 5 years. And it was impossible. Well, you could say Kennedy was a self-deceiver when he said it. You could say that, except in retrospect he wasn't, because it worked. And that was all enthusiasm too, and a bubble in a sense. But it worked. So there's no simple way out of these things. It's disruptive. And you know what happens too if you let your kids have fun out of control. Sooner or later, one of them bangs their head on a table or falls down the stairs or gives another kid a poke, or, it will, or breaks something, or, it isn't just that it bothers people, it's that it's Dionysian danger. It's orgiastic danger. You get too enthusiastic about things, you get into trouble. It's not negative emotion that drives teenage pregnancy. It's impulsive positive emotion. Right. Look at what they're doing. Why can't we catch up? Well, the same thing drives, look, Joe down the street just became an internet millionaire. What about us? Well, yeah, what about you? Maybe you could be an internet millionaire too. So lots of great things come out of crazy mania. I mean, lots of horrible things do too, but there's always a price, right? The price of success is a lot of failure. The price of success is a lot of mediocrity. So look at a university. Almost all the research that's done in the university is wrong. It's mediocre and wrong. Some of it isn't. Well, you might say, well, we should increase the amount that's good. It's like, yeah, no. Probably you can't. Probably what you can do is increase the total amount. So the total amount of good increases. But I don't think you can do much about the ratio, because most things require a lot of waste to move forward. A lot. So in a corporation, like, the corporate people are always saying, well, look at the universities, ivory tower. That's all rubbish, because in my experience, people in universities are way less risk averse than the typical person in a corporation. Like a middle manager, that's a sheep, generally. There's no risk in that guy at all. He doesn't want to stand out at all. He doesn't want to have a new idea or even be associated with one. He wants to hide where none of the predators can find it. But even in a corporation, say, forget about all that. 97% of the corporation's activity is just to keep itself going. 3%, 4%, 5% is profit. So gigantic things to move forward have to produce waste and uselessness all over, and you're lucky if you get some cream floating to the top. So, and you have to live with that. That's how it is. Well, what happens in a stock market bubble or a financial bubble is that it's too much enthusiasm. People see a reward of unspecified magnitude. So it's like a magic treasure. That's what happened with the internet. The internet is a magic treasure. True. Look at Google. They got all the treasure. Everyone knew it was there. Thought they knew. No one knew where it was. So they're chasing it like mad, right? In an enthusiastic rush. Well, was it stupid? For lots of people. It wasn't stupid for the people who happened to be in Google. So enthusiasm can easily get out of control. That's what happens when a party gets out of control. That's what happens. Enthusiasm makes people impulsive. It makes them discount the future because today is so great. Enthusiasm turns into mania. And so, everybody says, well, you should be happy. You should be feeling positive affect all the time. It's like, no, wrong. Positive affect is dangerous. You're always telling your kids to stop being so happy. You don't notice it, but they're running around causing trouble. They're having a wild time. They're throwing their arms in the air and they're laughing and they're running around. They're having fun. You say, hey, quiet down. And if you count your disciplinary actions, you'd be shocked at how often what you're doing is telling your children to stop having so much fun. So imagine a bubble is like walking up a mountain with a cliff on one side. You walk higher and higher, and maybe you're with a crowd of people, and then the whole crowd is saying, geez, it looks like this upwards road goes on forever, and aren't we doing much better than those fools who stayed on the flat ground? And the answer to that is absolutely, until you take one step over the cliff. The problem is you're in a fog. You don't know where the cliff is. You don't even know if there is a cliff. There probably is a cliff because there's been a cliff before, but lots of people, and the media, of course, was focusing on those people because it was a time of optimism, said, oh, well, the rules are different this time. We're in a state of permanent economic expansion. The internet has transformed everything. We're in a new electronic age. Maybe. Didn't work out that way. And then everyone says, well, we were fools to think that this couldn't happen. Well, the problem, it's going to happen. The problem is you cannot tell when. That's the problem with life. It's going to happen. And you can't tell when. Interest rates are how much money costs. Well, if money doesn't cost very much, people are going to use more of it. It's pretty straightforward. So it takes the brakes off things because it's less expensive to risk. That's why governments manipulate the interest rates, right? When they want to stimulate the economy, they drive down the interest rates to make money cheaper so that people spend more of it. So it certainly contributed to the housing boom, although I don't think it contributed nearly as much as crookedness did. It was a combination of radical innovation, which is always dangerous, although also necessary, and regulatory failure. What happened, as far as I can understand it, is that some financial wizards figured out that by bundling mortgages together, you could calculate their average riskiness. And then you could discount them according to that riskiness, and then you could sell them as high-grade investments. And the regulatory agencies went along with that, and that's partly because they're generally staffed by people who aren't as smart as the people who were manipulating the monetary system, for obvious reasons. And it was brilliant. It makes sense that if you take a bunch of risky investments that you can calculate the risk and discount it, then you stabilize it. It's brilliant, except for one thing. They didn't calculate the fact that everything could collapse at once. Now, what happened was when they transformed these risky investments into stable investments, they got really valuable. And so it was worthwhile for the banks to give mortgages to everybody they could possibly process. And that's where the crookedness started to seep in. They thought, well, it doesn't matter how risky the mortgage is because we'll average that out anyways. And we're going to make money on the tranche, I think they were called. Brilliant, except for the one thing that no one expected, which was that the whole bloody market could collapse at once. So, you can think, well, it's obvious in retrospect. It's not obvious. Like the American housing market value peaked way below what the Japanese housing market had peaked at, a few decades before. It was nothing like it. The Japanese real estate market got inflated way past the American. So you don't know where the top is. So, and the crookedness was people's failure to play by standard rules of risk evaluation. But even that's complicated because they thought, well, maybe these rules don't apply anymore. And that's what the guys who were making these bundled investments were trying to do. They were trying to make the old rules not apply anymore by eradicating the risk. Didn't work. Was it crooked? Probably. It's not so obvious, though. It certainly raised a specter in the back of people's minds, and the specter is, what are the rules? Who gets punished when they fail, and who doesn't? And what does too big to fail mean? Like, I think you could reverse that. So big failure is inevitable. That's a really good rule of thumb. And no, like, I think both the left and the right haven't seen that. Because the left thinks, well, big corporations, bad. And the right thinks, big government, bad. And maybe you should just think, big, bad. Too many eggs in one basket. So it goes against the principle of diversification. And I think there's some real truth in this. I think that as things get large, they turn into cyclops. They're lumbering, one-eyed giants. They can't see worth a damn. They're single-minded, which makes them really narrow. And they lumber around stepping on things accidentally till they fall off things. And I think that's the right model for a giant system. That's why we have the image of the giant cyclops. It's single-mindedness turned into gigantism, and it's risky. So should we bail out these big companies? There's something about that seems radically unfair. So, but I don't know what to do about that except to note that big in and of itself is troublesome. There's a tipping point with corruption, and you don't need much corruption before you hit that tipping point. And so what that means is the moral behavior of each individual is far more important than people generally think, because it doesn't take many cheaters getting away with it to make those who don't cheat think that they're fools. It's the probability of being caught that's the deterrent. It isn't the severity of the punishment. And we know that. That isn't questionable. We know that that's the case. And I don't know why conservatives don't. The reason they don't get it is because they vote by, they think by their temperament. And their temperament says, punish. It's not thinking, it's just a temperamental response. Whereas the liberal response is, well, those poor criminals must have had something happen to them that was terrible in their past or they wouldn't be criminals, which is, just equally as nonsensical. Here's a good analogy about government, I think. So in schools, there's always bullies. And bullies are aggressive kids who aren't really inclined to play by the rules. So they're aggressive and they're not very conscientious. And so they're kind of predatory. And they'll prey on other kids if given the opportunity. Okay, so how do you stop that? Well, you don't go around feeling sorry for the bullies because that doesn't work, and they don't have low self-esteem. They have high self-esteem. And the way that you deal with bullies is you have parents or teachers watch in the schoolyard, and every time a kid bullies someone else, you stop them. Now, you don't throw them in a cell for 10 years. You just stop what they're doing from having the desired outcome, and then bullying goes away. Now, this has been demonstrated by a guy in Scandinavia called Dan Olweus, he's reduced bullying in the Scandinavian countries by 50%. And the way he's done that is by ensuring that in schoolyards, bullies get caught, not that they get punished. Now, so translate that into political policy. Conservatives always argue that you should be hard on criminals, crack down on crime. It's like, yes. But the way they do it is by saying, well, let's have more extensive sentences. That's the wrong approach. The right approach is to decrease the probability that the crime will be successfully undertaken. So you have to decrease the success rate of the crime rather than increase the punishment. And that actually works. So for example, when they put drug addicts on a tight observation schedule and have a certain punishment associated with failing a drug test, the drug users who are on parole, they stop using drugs because they know they're not going to get away with it, period. So part of the role of the government is to ensure that rule breakers do not get away with it. And that's also part of the role of the citizenry. You shouldn't break rules, because if you do, you contribute to the likelihood that everything will fall apart. And B, you shouldn't let other people around you get away with breaking rules. So, that's the role of government. I mean, that's not all of it, but that's a big part of it. But the future isn't the past. You know what they say about the military, right? 100% prepared to fight the last war. And that's what life is like. You know, now some of the wisdom that we extract out of our previous experience applies to the future. But some of it doesn't. For me, what applies to the future is this sort of innate moral compass that people have. I think our sense of right and wrong is an evolutionarily, biologically determined function that helps inform us as to what course of action, on average, works the best across most situations. And so, as long as we follow that, we're as well off as we can be. It's as good as it's going to get. It's not going to be perfect because we're too fragile. I think we have in us built-in wisdom from the past, which is why we can live at all. And you can learn from the past, but even if you do, that doesn't protect you. Like, you can't be protected from the catastrophic transformations of the environment. The only way you can be protected, let me rephrase that. The only way you can be protected from the catastrophic transformations of the environment is to be willing to undergo catastrophic transformations in return. You have to be as flexible in your interpretive structures as the environment is in its randomness. It varies. We're not infinitely capable of it. You can tell that because we die. We fail to keep up with the environment. Its effects on us are deleterious. Now, some of us do better at that than others. Some of that's caution, care, attention, hard work. Some of it's luck. But no one manages it for more than about 100 years. So it's a losing, in some sense, it's a losing game in that you lose. You know, so then you might think, well, you know, it's hopeless. I don't buy that because I think there are things you can do during the course of your life that are of sufficient merit to make the game worthwhile. Well, the only solution to these sorts of problems that I've ever been able to come up with is that you have to attend to your own moral behavior. Like a complex system, like any complex social system, basically depends on trust. Trust. And trust roughly means you will say that you do something, and then you'll do it. And I'll say that I'll do something, and then I'll do it. And then I don't have to worry about the fact that you're chock full of snakes, because you could do anything. God only knows what you're capable of. But if you're able to act in accordance with your word, I can take you as a simplified entity. And then we can do business even if we don't know each other. I'll give you a quick example. So one day, one of my students, I lent my student my car and they hit a rainstorm and tapped it into an overpass and bent the bumper, and it was an old Cadillac. And I took it to a shop and they said, this was about 10 years ago, and they said, well, $1,500. And I thought, car's worth $1,500. So I went online, and you know, you can go online and have people bid for the right to give you a part. So I went online and I said, I need this bumper assembly for this Cadillac. So this guy phoned me from the southern US, and he said, well, I've got one of these. He said, I'll give it to you for $120. And I thought, okay, good. So then half an hour, he had a real southern accent, eh? Half an hour he phones back and he says, well, you know, I went out there and I looked at the thing, and one of the plastic panels on one side has a scratch in it, and I just thought I'd let you know in case you didn't want it. And I thought, oh, well, isn't that interesting that he did that? And I said, no, it's okay, you know, like as long as it's functional, it's better than the crushed up thing I have. And so that was good. And then half an hour later he phoned me and he said, do you want the whole assembly with the lights and everything? And I said, yeah, well, that's what I put in the quote. And he said, oh, I thought you just wanted the bumper. That's why it was so cheap, but it's okay, I'll send it to you anyway. And I thought, that's why capitalism works in the West. That's why. It's like, I don't know this guy. He's from some small town in, you know, the southern US. He doesn't know who I am. He's got, from a very narrow perspective, they have every reason in the world to overcharge me and send me junk. But he doesn't. Not only does he not, he goes above and beyond the call of duty to show that, you know, He tells me what's wrong with the part, and he gives it to me for less than he should have. Now, you think, well, that's not a canonical example. Wrong. It is a canonical example, and we have proof of that, and the proof is eBay. So when eBay started, everybody thought, that can't work. You'll send me junk, and I'll send you a check that bounces. And so we're not going to get anywhere with that. So when eBay first started, there were, what do they call those? They're like a little insurance company. I can't remember the name of. They're like a broker. Anyways,
like an intermediary.
Yeah, the idea was, for a percentage, I'll basically guarantee the trade. I'll make sure that this guy sends you the real thing, and that you send him money, and you'll pay me 5%. And if the thing fails, it's insurance. Well, it turned out that those people couldn't make any money, and the reason for that was the rate of honest exchange was staggeringly high. Staggeringly high between complete strangers on opposite ends of the continent. And now eventually eBay developed a rating system, so everybody's reputation was tracked. And what's interesting about that is that if you have a reputation of less than 98%, you're not doing very well. Like, the average is up in the high 90s. And there are people on eBay who have like 100,000 trades with 100% rating. So it makes trade transparent. Trust. Because I can safely send a sizable amount of money to a complete stranger and be virtually assured that what I'll get is what they said they'll send me. It's anybody who thinks that capitalism is immoral should think about that. I mean, that's so moral that it's a miracle. So now, when that trust starts to get eroded, like eBay would collapse. If 5% of the people regularly cheated, eBay would collapse. Because you don't want to get burned. And you don't have to get burned a couple of times before you're really gun shy, because people are very, 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 very sensitive to being burned. We remember that like that. We remember that like you wouldn't believe. So capitalism works because of trust. And so if people act crookedly, or if they take advantage of the system, which seems to have been, at least the public perception is that happened on a large scale in 2008, the whole thing starts to rock, and it makes people very uneasy. Money is trust, because all money is a symbol of the possibility of engaging in an honest transaction. That's all money is. People say it's just paper. Well, it's not. Paper is a marker for trust. It's a promissory note. And the promise is, well, I have this piece of paper and I can exchange it with you for something of the value that we decree it has. And you won't screw me. And like I said, the probability doesn't have to be very high that I'm going to get burned before that starts to fall apart. So there's this philosopher of religion named Mircea Eliade, and he has this interesting take on flood myths. And so what happens in a flood is, people are living their lives, and then they get all sinful, and then God gets irritated and washes them away. It happens everyone knows the story, and the story is distributed worldwide. And basically it's a story of the catastrophic collapse of large-scale systems, which happens all the time. It's a repeated theme in the Old Testament. The Israelites set up a system and it collapses, and then they set up another and it collapses, and then they set up another and it collapses, over and over. So Eliade, looking at all this, was trying to untangle the theme. What's the theme here? And he found two elements. One, systems deteriorate of their own accord. It's like a thermodynamic law. You set up a system and it's static, a state, it's static. And it's working, but the environment to which it's adapted is dynamic. So just by staying the same, it moves farther and farther away from the environment. And so just by staying the same, the bloody thing will collapse. Okay, so that's thing one. Element one. Element two is, you can speed the collapse as a participant in that system by being willfully blind to those environmental changes that you could adapt to. So you pretend they're not happening. And the more people in the system that pretend that the changes aren't happening, the less the system can make all the little micro changes that it needs to make in order to stay caught up with the environment. And by being willfully blind in that manner, they increase the probability that the whole thing is going to collapse. And so God floods the earth, partly because things just get old and fall apart, the walls crumble, and because of the sins of men. And the sins of men are failure to pay attention and to make adjustments when you know bloody well that they're necessary. You just don't do it. And so, and that's right. That's right. That's why every culture talks about it. So, in terms of individual responsibility, I mean, part of the role that you play in ensuring that systems don't collapse precipitously is to keep your own systems dynamic and alive. And you can tell that. You're not guilty. You're not carrying a boatload of rubbish around in your conscience. There isn't unfinished business all around you. There aren't monsters hiding underneath your rug. There's not unfinished business with all of your family members and your business compatriots and so on. You bloody well know when you're in a chaotic mess, and you know every step of the way when you generate it. Don't do that. That's your collapse. It precipitates it, and it will come. You might think it won't. It'll come. You cannot... I've seen two things really contribute to people's catastrophic failure. One is resentment. Poor me. There's a bunch of things I have to do because I'm a slave. The second is arrogance. Arrogance is, I can get away with it. And what that really means is, I can twist the fabric of reality to suit my wishes. It's like, no, you can't. Because the fabric of reality, there's a lot of it, and there isn't very much of you. And you can twist it and deform it and stretch it. But it's like holding a metal ruler up to your face and bending it. Sure, you can bend it, and you can bend it, and you can bend it. But at some point, you're going to let go, and the snap that hits you in the head is going to be proportionate to the degree that you bent it. And that's as far as I'm concerned, that's an absolute law, unless you think you can twist reality to suit your own purposes. I mean, do you really think that? You know, you're not omniscient. So you can't bend reality to suit your purposes. You're lucky if you can sort of cooperate with it so it doesn't just grind you into pulp.
Birds come and cry there and twitter in the chimney, but I go forever and come again.